the labour market can absorb these people and needs these people for the economy to grow, but we just haven't kept up with it in terms of our housing and infrastructure.
No one will know on that day what the issue was, and that no one needs to go there beyond the fact that he was given a warning for his failure.
There have been a number of big die-offs of fish. Recently, around 1 million died due to a bacterial infection.
No doubt about it. It is an achievement. They've been working very hard on it.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, Australia's rapid population growth, driven largely by record levels of immigration, is fueling both economic opportunities and significant challenges, particularly in housing and infrastructure. Australia correspondent Lachlan Cahoon with this.
Just about everyone in New Zealand knows someone who is living in Australia, and those numbers seem to be growing each year. Kiwi immigration is part of something called the move to a big Australia. While this has momentum, it's also controversial both socially and economically. NBR's Sydney correspondent Lachlan Calhoun is tackling the subject in his Underarm column this week. So Lachlan, let's just get the facts first. How many Kiwis are in Australia and where are they?
So currently, Simon, there are about 30,000 Kiwis arriving in Australia to live each year. So the Kiwi population is at around 600,000 right now. So I think that's more than 10% of the entire New Zealand population. So the census shows that they really like Queensland. Maybe it's the warmer weather there that they go for. The Brisbane suburb of Upper Coomera is the most popular, apparently. It's more close to the Gold Coast, I'm told. It's home to around 3,000 Kiwis. But isn't Coomera also a vegetable in New Zealand?
Yes, it is. There is a link there.
It's spelled differently. But we should also know the fact that you are nothing if not contrarian, Simon.
I am.
And as an Australian-born person, you've gone the other way.
Yes. I'd like to say I set a trend, but nobody followed. Anyway, hey, did you know that our former Prime Minister over here from quite some time ago, Robert Muldoon, once famously said, Kiwis moving to Australia raise the IQ on both sides of the Tasman? So I don't know if that's happening as well.
The Australian census hasn't calculated that, but that's probably worth a look.
No IQ calculation. All right. So what is the general growth in population and how close is this to this concept of big Australia?
Sure. So look, we've had record immigration in recent years. Not only a lot of Kiwis coming here, but a lot of people. The record was close to 450,000 net arrivals in 2023. So only slightly down last year, 446,000. So our population is now at more than 27 million. It went through that late last year. So it's more than doubled in 50 years. So this big Australia concept was articulated by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd about 10 or 15 years ago. He wanted a population of 36 million by 2050. It looks like we're going to exceed that.
Wow.
Our cities are turning into mega cities. Sydney and Melbourne, both over 5 million. Some say that Melbourne is going to overtake Sydney in the next few years, but there's incredible urban sprawl happening in both cities. I live in Sydney. To the north, we have Newcastle, which is about just under 200 kilometres. To the south, we have Wollongong, about 90 kilometres. Pretty soon it's just going to be one strip of urban growth and housing between those two cities, going about 300 kilometres down the coast. So the idea for a big Australia was economically driven, but it has come with growing pains. There's no doubt about that.
So let's delve into that. What are those sort of economic impacts, both long and short term?
Yeah, so look, if we hadn't had the immigration we've had over the last couple of years, we would have been in a recession here in Australia.
Right.
We've actually been in what's called a per capita recession, but we've been saved from a technical recession by immigration numbers only. So, but Treasury estimates that migrants are good economically. Apparently, they pay nearly $130,000 more tax over their lifetimes to the government than people who were born here.
They're much better model citizens than actual Aussies.
Apparently so. So they make a bigger market. And they fill in the skills gaps. We have a big history of missing out on certain skills in a lot of industries. And we've been filling that with migration historically. So the whole history of this country and its economic growth has been built on migration. But where we used to take in just under 100,000 people a year for many years, that significantly increased, as we've seen 4 or 5 times. So the housing and infrastructure is straining. Big housing shortages, rents are skyrocketing, housing prices have gone up, simply driven driven by supply and demand. Even though interest rates have gone up, so have housing prices. So that's not what normally happens. We have younger generations locked out of home ownership. And that's creating a big backlash. And I won't even go into the area of racism, which is a whole other area. But at the same time, unemployment is incredibly low in Australia. It's at just over 4%. So the labour market can absorb these people and needs these people for the economy to grow. But we just haven't kept up with it in terms of our housing and infrastructure.
Right. Okay. So population growth, which got a lot going on, it's identified by a recent report as one of the major challenges for whichever government wins the next election, which is just around the corner.
Yep.
So what are those challenges that were identified?
Yeah, well, this is a UNSW report, University of New South Wales. They said it was the second biggest challenge for government for several reasons. I mean, there's been a big backlash against immigration, as I just outlined, and there's a belief that it should be cut back, and it probably will be no matter who wins the election. But that might alleviate the housing issue in the short term, only a little bit. But in the long term, we've got a rapidly ageing population here. I mean, the percentage of people over 65 is currently at about 17%. It's going to be in the next couple of decades, that's going to increase to 25%. So 1 in 4 Australians is going to be 65 years old or over. So who's going to do the work and pay the taxes to support them? I mean, our birth rate is falling. It's at under 300,000 births per year. So the natural solution to that is immigration, even if it is unpopular. So there's a balance that needs to be struck, obviously, and I guess that's a challenge. I mean, the alternative is raising productivity, and that's a whole other argument, which is another of the challenges the government has got. But our productivity is falling as well, but that's probably a topic for another column.
Absolutely. Similar topics over here. Lachlan Colquhoun, thanks very much.
Cheers, Simon. Thanks a lot.
Back home, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon's recent trip to India marked a significant development as New Zealand and India started free trade talks. Political editor Brent Edwards has the latest. India and New Zealand have restarted free trade talks. Well, let's bring in our political editor Brent Edwards. And Brent, how much of an achievement is this for Prime Minister Christopher Luxon?
Well, if you remember in the election campaign, he talked about negotiating and doing a deal by the time of the next election. So, look, 15 months roughly into this government, and, they've got an agreement to start talks again. So, look, no doubt about it, it is an achievement. They've been working very hard on it. I think Todd McClay has been to India about at least 5 times. Winston Peters has been there, obviously. Christopher Luxon has met the Indian Prime Minister Modi at international forums and discussed it. So there's been a lot of work going on. So, yeah, it is an achievement.
So will the deal get done before the election?
Well, that then is obviously the big question. And I think from what I can read, there was a bit of joking in India about, they could do it in 90 days or maybe 60 days. But I don't think anyone thinks that is likely. So, I mean, there are a lot of issues to go through. So normally trade negotiations take a long time. So, we'll just have to wait and see. But there are some particularly, obviously, prickly issues that the two countries have to deal with in these negotiations.
What are the trade-offs?
Well, the trade-offs are, and this could speed up the negotiation, if New Zealand, for instance, takes a pretty soft approach, particularly on dairy and beef access, and I think apples is another issue, and basically puts them to one side, so effectively doesn't really argue the case for improved access for them, that will make it a lot easier to get a deal with India. Now, until now, everyone said, no, you can't go soft on dairy, particularly, if you don't get dairy, it's not worth that kind of thing. Right. But, if you think back to the previous Labor government, when they negotiated the free trade deal with the European Union, effectively dairy and meat were off that. But there was a recognition that the gains were so good for other goods that it was worth doing. And it also means you've got your foot in the door. You can upgrade these agreements at a later stage.
But is a lesser deal better than doing nothing at all?
Well, that's, I guess, will be the balancing judgment that the government will have to make. But I think, as I say, most people tend to argue it's better to get a deal of some sort so that you can then continue to negotiate and upgrade. If you look at the Australian deal, for instance, they've had a free trade agreement with India for a while now, which has put them ahead of New Zealand in a number of goods, but things like dairy and apples were off it. But they've got an opportunity. They're trying to go and now negotiate an upgrade to the agreement. So The idea is if you get a trade agreement and it starts operating and the two countries get used to it, then it might be easier to convince the Indian government, for instance, that giving more access for dairy, for instance, won't be as detrimental to their dairy industry as they think. And one of the arguments the New Zealand government has been putting up is, in fact, okay, dairy could actually help grow the Indian dairy industry rather than be seen as a threat to it.
In this week's Toil and Trouble, a recent $30,000 fine for breaching an employee's privacy highlights the importance for employers to carefully manage disciplinary actions and prevent the spread of sensitive information. DLA Piper partner Carl Blake speaks with Fiona Rotherham.
Toil and Trouble this week looks at a recent case before the Human Rights Review Tribunal, where there's been another high damages award for breach of privacy. Well, welcome to Carl Blake, partner with DLA Piper. What's the background to this case, Carl?
Okay, so it's an issue of a transport company. We have, as you would expect, they have a drug and alcohol testing policy. In this case, Mr Cummings initially refused a drug test, and that triggered there was no details in the case, but in my experience that would trigger a disciplinary process. There's no presumption that there was a positive drugs present, but it was more a failure to undertake the test is in itself a disciplinary issue. So he was suspended and a disciplinary process was commenced. He then had a subsequent test done and he was clear. So that part of the issue was put to bed, but the disciplinary process continued. And ultimately that led to him being given a warning for not accepting the initial drugs test. So you think that would be the end of it, but no. So 10 days later, he's at a client's premises and someone says to him, "Oh, I heard you were a drug dealer and you had lost your job." And that was very distressing to Mr Cummings. He then returned to his site and a co-worker said a similar rumour. He heard he had lost his job because he had failed a drugs test. Mr Cummings took issue with this. He wanted a meeting with his employer to discuss it. They effectively, they said they looked into his concerns, but they dismissed them. He felt he had no option but to resign and then did so. So the framework was essentially, if it was in the Employment Relations Authority, it would have probably been more of a constructive dismissal argument. But here, he was simply saying, look, you've breached my privacy by somehow it got out that I had refused this drugs test. And this is where it gets very interesting. So typically you would expect the actual recipient or to prove the actual, who was it that actually leaked this information. And the client did not give evidence during the case, and the Human Rights Review Tribunal essentially just logic prevailed. They said the proximity of the disciplinary meeting and the market hearing about this, it must have been the company. And they looked at some of the internal workings of how these things are supposed to operate. There's a presumption that information shared within a business can be done for appropriate reasons. You know, if you are reporting to the board or you're reporting to your CEO, you're going to need to explain details of a disciplinary matter.
There's some people who need to know.
Correct. But while the principle in this case of the Information Privacy Principle 11, which is you can't share information with others, meaning another entity, the tribunal first of all looked at, well, what about sharing it internally? Can that be a problem? And they said, yes, it can. So even if your information is not leaving your building, it can still be a breach of privacy. If, for example, you put an all users bulletin saying Mr Cummings had refused the drugs test. But it was satisfied that the right people knew. So,
but it's hard in a small business, isn't it, Carl? Because, everyone kind of knows each other's business.
Exactly. So you apply that principle to a very small operation to a big one. There's still a chain of command and a chain of people who need to know, and no one can really tell you who that is, but you'll know it when you see it. So here the issue was, it's not so much the internal dissemination of that information. It was, someone's obviously leaked it, and there was a presumption that that must have happened. There was no clear findings as to who or when or certainly why, but the tribunal was satisfied that someone had provided that information outside of the business inappropriately, and that caused Mr Cummings humiliation, loss of dignity, injury to feelings, and resulted in a compensation award of $30,000. Now that got my attention because it had been a number of years since many of your readers will have been aware of what they call the cake case, the Credit Baywide Union case of the offence of cake icing. and effectively an employer who badmouthed an employee in the market. And this is where we are seeing far more significant damages awards, because it's not just an inadvertent breach, or it's not where someone's personal information has been somehow misappropriated or leaked, like someone's bank account or something, which is obviously a significant privacy breach, but it doesn't really impact them in the market, whereas this was really disparaging to this employee, just like Credit Union Baywide in the market there, similar here. So that's where we're seeing these high damages awards.
The dispute also followed Mr Cummings to his next place of work, but the tribunal didn't award any pecuniary losses over that. Why not?
Yeah, so the interesting that, as I said, if it was if he had his constructive dismissal claim heard in the Employment Relations Authority, it may have had a different ending there.
Did he go
not
to
that
the
I'm not that I'm well, certainly not that I'm aware of it. He may
Mm.
have, but in this jurisdiction, they said there wasn't a close enough link between the resignation and loss of work, meaning it wasn't such a serious act by the employer to force him to resign, even though that is getting into the ERA territory. So that's why there was no lost wages component.
So what should employers do if they're in the same boat to avoid these sort of pecuniary losses? Because, I mean, that stacks up for any size business, really.
It's tough. I mean, gossip. It's the sort of information is sometimes irresistible to not talk about. It's I can just
journalists
speculate.
are the worst. We all want to know.
You can just speculate as to, if someone refuses a drugs test, obviously, as I said earlier, there's that presumption. Or what does that mean? Why would he do that? That must mean he's got drugs in his system.
Why did he do it? Was that clear?
Doesn't say.
Right.
All we know is that that triggered a disciplinary process for the failure to do it, not a presumption that he had drugs in his system, because as the case shows, subsequently he did have a test which was clear. Now, no one will know on that day what the issue was, and that no one needs to go there beyond the fact that he was given a warning for his failure. So that's the presumption. But it's that irresistible urge. Someone in the business, according to this case at least, is found to have used that information, drawn a conclusion that they shouldn't have. He certainly wasn't a drug dealer, so that was clearly embellished or somehow got picked up and snowballed till it landed with a client, and they said, "I thought you'd been fired."
So what should a company do? I mean, what information can be disclosed?
So I think, going back to basic principles, as you said, small or large, you've got an allegation, could be anything, theft, harassment, whatever. Tell the people who need to know only, and there's a presumption that if you're telling your CEO or the board, you'd hope, if you're an HR manager, that you wouldn't have to say, "Oh, by the way, keep this confidential." You'd hope that's implied. But if there's any potential for confusion, perhaps it's mid-management, perhaps it's a management layer that doesn't commonly deal with these issues and it's novel for them. So perhaps a reminder, look, this is highly sensitive, we need to keep this confidential. It clearly will give the employee an opportunity for comment, and they can seek advice and support in any disciplinary process. But it's a confidential matter between them and the business, and no one's to be told in the business that doesn't need to know, and absolutely no one's to be told out of the business.
So what do you say to those that ask, just it's private, I can't talk about it?
Well, yeah. So let's just say, well, first of all, it should never happen because no one should be asking these questions. But let's say someone had rung the business and said, "What's going on with Mr. Cummings? Has he lost his job?" Yes, it's a balance there. You'd absolutely, less is more, but trying to right the ship, saying, "No, that's not correct. There's a process, but it's a confidential matter between him and the business."
And just finally, Carl, what happens if Mr. Cummings had raised it at work, or had told some? But what if he'd talked about it first?
That actually is interesting, because I see this a bit, particularly when someone has said, it could be anything from a redundancy to a disciplinary. I'm hearing about this in the market, and the evidence that my clients might give me is, well, actually he was telling everyone in the lunchroom that he's going to get fired or something like that. So it's a two-way street. The employee also has obligations of confidentiality. There was no suggestion in this case that he'd done anything to share this information. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. It's kind of a cultural issue, like a workplace culture, in the sense of trying to have an all-users town hall about we need to stop gossip. I mean, it's extraordinarily difficult to manage, and you're trying to sort of put out fires as you go. But trying to avoid gossip and speculation in a workplace can be very tricky, particularly if it's small.
Finally, as the Australian salmon industry faces growing environmental concerns and consumer backlash, New Zealand salmon producers may have a significant opportunity to capture a larger share of the market. Let's hear from Lachlan Cahoon on the implications for Australia.
Earlier this month, the Luxon government entered into a funding partnership with New Zealand King Salmon to further develop sustainable farming. NBR's Australian correspondent Lachlan Colquhoun is looking at this issue in his Shoeshine column this week. Lachlan, can you start by giving us an overview of the Aussie salmon industry?
Sure, Simon. And I guess our salmon industry has some significant issues, and that's what I'm picking up on in the column this week. The Australian salmon industry is centred in Tasmania, largely on the west coast in Macquarie Harbour. It's a wilderness sort of area originally, and it's the second largest harbour in Australia. The salmon industry is also on the east coast, but most of it's in Macquarie Harbour. So there are three main producers. None of them are Australian-owned, by the way. One is a Brazilian company, JBS, which is well known for being hit with over $3 billion in fines a few years ago for corruption. Tassal, which you would think means Tasmanian salmon, and it used to, but now they're owned by a Canadian company called Cook Seafood. And then we have Petuna, which is now owned 100% by Sealord of New Zealand. They bought that a few years ago. So this is an industry which the Tasmanian government says is worth over $1.3 billion a year. It farms Atlantic salmon, the Atlantic salmon species, which was introduced into Australia in the 1970s.
Right. Okay, so you say it's mired in controversy. What are the problems?
Yeah. Well, so the industry has been under pretty sustained attack amid claims it's polluting the environment and it's not operating sustainably. I mean, there have been a number of big die-offs of fish. Recently, around 1 million died due to a bacterial infection. And the industry says this is a one-off. Others disagree. The salmon pens release a lot of nitrogen into the water from uneaten food and salmon poo. This is allegedly endangering a rare species of skate in Macquarie Harbour. And a few weeks ago, one of the salmon producers had their accreditation from the RSPCA withdrawn because of cruelty to the fish. They had images from a drone of them throwing out dead fish bins with live fish in them as well. So it was fairly shocking images that saw the RSPCA withdraw their accreditation. Right. So also the industry uses antibiotics to prevent infection in the salmon pens, and a lot of these antibiotics have leached out, and wild fish have been caught in Macquarie Harbour. They've also got high levels of antibiotics. So there's a big push by environmentalists here to have the industry scaled back or located outside of the harbour and other estuaries. And they say the industry releases as much pollution as a city of about 500,000 people. And that's about twice the size of the Tasmanian capital of Hobart.
Doesn't really whet the appetite, does it? How are consumers responding?
Well, there's been a big backlash in Tasmania. Locals, hundreds of them gathered earlier this month to protest plans to extend a farm on the eastern side of the island. But on a wider scale, there's been calls for a big consumer boycott. Activist shareholders put an agenda item on the Woolworths AGM list last year for the company not to stock salmon from Tasmania. That was defeated, but the fact that it was actually voted on is quite significant. And there was a petition which got over 40,000 signatures that people should boycott Tasmanian salmon. More recently, and perhaps significantly, a food delivery app which is centred on Canberra and Sydney. They deliver to about 13,000 people. They dropped Tasmanian salmon and replaced it with king salmon from New Zealand. They say they've been worried about Tasmanian salmon for a while. They went over to New Zealand and checked out the industry there, and that gave them confidence to stock the New Zealand salmon. And even though it's more expensive in Australia for people to buy that, they say that they're selling more salmon now that they've replaced Aussie salmon with Kiwi salmon.
Right, so that circles back to this investment from the government or funding partnership with New Zealand King Salmon. Is this an opportunity for New Zealand?
Definitely. I'd say it was a huge opportunity for New Zealand. I mean, salmon's hugely popular in Australia. People are changing their diet and using salmon, presumably as a healthy alternative to red meat and protein. And yet here we have these issues with the sustainability of the salmon. So the big question mark over the salmon that comes from Tasmania for many people. We eat around 60,000 tonnes of salmon a year, and most of it's farmed locally. So New Zealand, you guys are selling more salmon here. I think the value was around 20 million Aussie dollars last year. And that was up around 15% year on year. I think you largely export to China and the United States, but exports of king salmon from New Zealand to Australia are increasing. So certainly I'm aware that the New Zealand salmon industry has had its issues, but they're not well known in Australia. And I think that those issues are largely cancelled out by when Australians look at the industry here and the problems that it's got. So the campaign against Tasmanian salmon has momentum, real momentum.
Right.
And the New Zealand product has a strong brand reputation. So if the consumer backlash here continues, then we can expect New Zealand to be exporting more of its product here.
Thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news you can use on mbr.co.nz. See you next week.